the British Parliament needed to persuade the Indian individuals of their privileges as British subjects and assist with re-establishing harmony to the nation, and in 1858 gave Victoria a declaration known as the Indian Individuals' Magna Carta. Following the Indian Revolt, the British Parliament passed the Government of India Act, which moved authoritative powers and powers of the EIC to the British Crown, before the Indian Government Act of 1858, British Crown. English East India Company. For around 250 years the organisation had its own multitude of 260,000 individuals. In the start of the 19th century and the allies of the British Industrial Revolution oppressed India's flourishing industry. At that point the East India Company was associated with everything from opium dependence on China. The organization developed opium in India and afterward illicitly sent out it to China for Chinese products, to the worldwide slave exchange, providing slaves, moving slaves, also, using slave work all through the 17 learning objectives. Description of the East India Company. Key points. Highlights. In the 1600s, London shippers appealed to Queen Elizabeth I for consent to cruise the Indian Ocean, and a gathering of British finance managers asked Elizabeth I for a regal contract to go toward the East Indies in return for a syndication on exchange. In 1702 the public authority demanded a consolidation that was finished in 170809 as the United Company of Merchants of England trading toward the East Indies. It was the body that he dispatched in the Indian legislative issues 40 years after the fact, as by the 1700s the organization had adequately developed to rule the worldwide material exchange and surprisingly coordinated its own military to protect its inclinations. The greater part of the powers were based at 3 significant stations in India: Madras, Bombay and Bengal. After an uprising in India in 1857, the British government assumed responsibility for the organization. In 1858, after a significant stretch of emergency, the British government finished corporate administration in India, and the Whigs established another organization which couldn't supplant the bygone one. Following quite a while of battle, however, its expectations were stopped by the conflict in India and the Great Whig upset of 168889. Before long the organization observed another beneficial bearing in the Chinese tea exchange, which by 1750 had expanded by an excess of multiple times. The organization was a gathering of London dealers who was drawn in by an Oriental viewpoint that was exceptional to the public person of the Dutch organization, and was initially coordinated on a one-time trip premise. His motivation was to exchange flavour, which was first made in 1600 by a British public organisation, the New British East India Company, as in no other British organisation could lawfully exchange the region yet slandered it. Savage contest from the Spanish and Portuguese, who previously had exchanging for this space. Regardless of Dutch resistance, England got exchange concessions from the Mughal Empire and started exchanging cotton and silk, textures, indigo colour, saltpeter, used to save meat and furthermore to make explosives, and flavours. Worried that the British were lingering behind the Dutch in these new shipping lanes, Queen Elizabeth I conceded the option to exchange the East Indies on December 31, 1600. Throughout the long term the British had seen a monstrous development of their business tasks in India. After the Portuguese circumnavigated Cape of Good Hope in 1488 on the southern tip of Africa, opening ocean courses through theft to the Far East and the Indian Ocean, the European forces tried to build up their own exchanging focuses. England exchanged India from around 1600 yet just started to hold on to enormous spaces of land in 1757, after Spain and Portugal hoarded the Indian Ocean. The British Parliament renounced the company's business permit as per the arrangements of the Charter Act 1833, with the outcome that the organisation turned out to be essential for the British government, yet the organisation of British India stayed in the possession of organisation authorities. Organization administration. The new organization's legislatures depended on the states of the Indian states they had toppled, and the greater part of the genuine authoritative work was at first completed by Indians. In India, the legislative leaders of the companies exchanging settlements became legislative heads of the provinces, and albeit the before long Clive and other organization officers crushed Indians, French and different powers testing British impact of India. Gigantic armed forces were made, generally made out of Indian serotypes yet for certain normal British regiments. These militaries were utilized to safeguard company regions, constrain adjoining Indian states and stifle any possible interior opposition. Organization. The executives. The new organization government legislatures depended on the legislatures of the Indian states they toppled, and a large portion of the genuine organization work was at first completed by the Indians. After the main Indian conflict of freedom, the British government assumed responsibility for the foundation of British principle. English principle alludes to the time of British Standard in the Indian subcontinent from 1858 to 1947. The British administered the subcontinent successfully for almost 2 centuries from 1750 to 1947 with somewhat little obstruction and distress, before the Indian Government Act of 1858 put the British Crown under direct control. Toward the start of the 19th century, the organization had its own multitude of 260,000 individuals, and the allies of the British Industrial Revolution booting India's flourishing enterprises. Under British Standard, India's portion of worldwide assembling trades tumbled from 27% to 2%, as East Indian workers amassed tremendous fortunes. The Marquis of Salisbury, Secretary of Territory of India, commented that in the late 19th century India was Britain's biggest kind of revenue. The new British East India Company was a syndication, as in no other British public could legitimately exchange on the region, yet confronted hardened rivalry from Spain and Portugal that previously had exchanging stations India, just as from the Dutch Indian Organization Orientale established in 1602, which acquired the restraining infrastructure privileges to exchange the public person of Dutch society the 1600s. Notwithstanding, this was to be a defining moment for the general public, and before long it procured full authoritative forces in its domain, including the option to burden any individual who lived inside its boundaries. The British government has gotten done with a task no other organization has done throughout the entire existence of humanity, and in this manner it is impossible that it will go after a long time to come. The organization saw its fortunes develop and become predominant when one of its officials, Robert Clive, crushed the Bengali Nawab power Siraj-ud-Dowlah in 1757 at the Battle of Plassas. The subcontinent was presently administered by the investors of the East India Company, who chose every year business legislators to direct arrangement on that region. The biggest of these was the British East India Company that controlled 66% of the subcontinent. England exchanged India from around 1600, yet didn't start to hold on to huge lots of land before 1757, after the Battle of Plassas. For quite a long time Britain has pushed for an offering a rich and worthwhile flavor exchange East India coined by Spain and Portugal.